Truth Be Told, a Generation X based fic. Chapter 4. Yvette's Story. I helped Richard off the floor, but it was tricky. I was upset with Jonathan for not doing what he had been told to do, so I was doing my best not to let my hands tense up. I didn't want to hurt Richard as I helped him up. While I was doing that, I glared at Jonathan, wondering why he delayed. I still had my instincts, and I knew if there was a threat, you had to act first and question it later. I didn't understand why he waited. I was about to lash out at him verbally when Richard spoke to me in the link we shared when he was near me. "It's all right, love. You have to remember that he injured someone once before with his powers. He didn't want to hurt another friend." For a moment, I couldn't believe he was defending the hesitation on Jonah's part. I looked at Richard, noticing his eyes had taken on the solid brown color that signaled he had my powers at the moment. I then responded on that link, "But he let the fake one almost kill you. How can you forgive that so easily?" I saw a sheepish smile cross his face as he confessed to me. "To be honest, I started to having my own doubts. I thought I might have told Sean that the real one was a clone instead of real. At least when the one attacked me, we knew the truth." I was impressed that he remained calm after that. He had told me that he had been known to have a temper. I then saw Sean, Angelo, and Jonah walk over to us. Sean was the one who asked what I already knew the answer of. "Richard, lad, are you all right?" He asked that as he held out a hand to help Richard up. I knew Sean meant it, since he always tried to earn my trust. The only reason I never spoke up then was I didn't fully know how. I still felt a bit sorry about the injuries he had obtained carrying me into the school. When Richard took Sean's hand, Sean and I helped him get to his feet. I heard Richard say as he got to his feet, "As best I can be expected from an experience similar to getting a hug from a boa." I had been confused by that statement until Richard looked at me and said, "That's a type of snake known for crushing their victims." I understood the statement then, and seeing him give a little smile at that point made me feel better about the scenario, even though things weren't right. I then heard Angelo say, "So we have an unconscious Mondo in the med unit, and a madman on the grounds, if I overheard things right." I wondered what Angelo meant. I hadn't seen him when I first arrived with Richard, but it was possible that he had come up behind Jonathan and Sean. He was walking behind them as they arrived. I saw Sean turn unfazed by the statement and nod at Angelo. "That is a nice way of putting it, as well as accurate." I then heard Sean sigh, and then addressed us in what I can only figure is his official tone, which was accompanied by a gesture for all of us to gather round. "We have a major problem, and we've got to stop it before the others return from Monaco." I watched as Sean looked at Richard and said, "Skits, do you remember where ye had found Mondo and sensed my cousin?" I looked at Richard and saw him nod. The smile he had moments ago was gone, and I knew he was ready for this. Outside the tangle with M-Plate not too long ago, Richard hadn't been in any fights. This was going to be his first real challenge, and I knew I would be there for him. Sean then continued speaking, letting us know we were preparing to battle a serious threat. "Chamber, I want you to start charging up for another blast. Skin, I want you to be ready at a moment's notice. That ability of yours will be needed to pull any one of us out of harm's way. I saw Angelo nod in understanding. He had then looked at us, and Sean gave us our orders. Skits, I hope you are keeping Penance's power on you. You two might be the only weapons we have until Chamber is ready. Hearing him use our code names really drove the point home. I watched as Richard tensed up as much as he could. It wasn't going to be easy since we hadn't gotten into our uniforms. In fact, neither Richard or I had team uniforms at this point. Our abilities made it hard to find a fabric that could withstand them. Richard finally nodded and said, I'm ready, Banshee. He then turned to face me and asked, Are you ready, Penny? I nodded and tensed up as much as I could as well. I will admit I was a little more relaxed about it since he used the nickname form of my code name. Once I was ready, I nodded and said, Let's go save our school. It was more than a school to me, though. It was my home. I also noticed Richard approved of my attitude. He had given me a slight smile, and we all headed out. Richard had taken point and led us into the one section of the forest around the school. I had a feeling we were past the point where the alarms would have noticed an intruder, since they should have notified us about the man's intrusion into the grounds. Sean had said they were adjusted after Emplate's last attack. I paused when Richard stopped, and I could sense some anxiety from him. We had reached the point where he must have detected Sean's cousin. I remained on alert as Sean nodded and shouted, All right, Tom. We know you're here, so show yourself. We even stopped your clone. The whole time Sean had been speaking, he signaled us to take our positions. Angelo and Jono were just behind Sean while Richard and I were in the front. Both of us had been watching the woods, waiting for a threatening movement of any kind. While we waited, Richard spoke to me in our mental link, and his words told me he was scared about something. I hope it doesn't come down to fighting. I took a moment to look at him, and I saw there was worry in his eyes. I quickly asked him, What's wrong? To be honest, I wasn't overly surprised when he responded, Remember what I said about my temper? That had been something he told me about shortly after we met. Richard was one of those people who held their temper in until it came out all at once. I looked back at Richard and mentally said, Don't lose control now. I don't know how the extreme of my abilities. I don't want to find out about it because you used it. I quickly remembered seeing what happened when Jubilee lost control of her powers when she was upset. I noticed Richard shuddered as well, as if he had glanced at my thoughts. He then replied, For your sake, Yvette, I'll try not to lose control. I wanted to thank him for saying that, but the moment was cut short. We had both seen movement and had placed our focus on it. It had been in front of us, and when I heard the voice, I went on alert. The voice had an eerie quality to it, and it sent chills down my spine when it spoke. Well, cousin, I was hoping to meet you later. How did you find out I was here? Did my fake Mondo do something unexpected? It was then I saw the source of the voice, and I swear, the man looked like he was part plant. It looked wrong. A quick glance at Sean told me that he was both upset and worried. I didn't know the full story about what happened between them, but I could tell by his tone as he spoke. Why are you here, Tom? I know it isn't good. So what are you planning? For a moment, I thought that he was even going to use his powers on our current foe. The figure didn't act like he had been threatened at all. Tom seemed confident as he responded to Sean's question, and there was malice in it as well. Isn't it obvious, cousin? You are being replaced as teacher here. As of right now, I'm in charge. At that moment, two giant roots rose from the ground like two giant snakes, and I recalled what Richard had said about being hugged by a boa. The first one lashed out and grabbed Sean, throwing him in the process, as Tom said, I will admit this wasn't part of the plan to begin with, but I can adapt, as you can see. This power isn't one you're immune to. Luckily, Sean hit the ground and only looked dazed at the moment. I then saw Tom look at us, and the second root starting to come towards us. As Richard and I went to avoid the attack, Tom demonstrated that he suspected one of us caused the events that escalated his plan. I figure one of you two alerted my dear cousin to my arrival. Well, let me demonstrate how I took down your friend Mondo. The second root came at us. It would have hit Richard as it struck, but he leapt out of the way in time. I should have been watching the other root. Because it struck me hard, I went flying through the air, and I was able to see I was going to hit one of the older trees. I knew when I hit it, it would hurt, and there was no telling how my power would complicate things. In a second I saw it. Angelo was using his powers to grab me. I quickly reeled in my powers so he could safely grab me. I had done it in time, and he pulled me to safety. To my dismay, however, it wasn't in time to stop the scream I heard in my head. Richard was screaming in rage and anger. He saw me get hurt and thrown to what might have been a lethal injury. He was going to let loose on who did it. Angelo, who was not a stranger to painful memories, could see that Yvette was starting to have trouble continuing the story. He sat forward and looked at her. Yvette, you want me to continue from this point? He wouldn't if she didn't want him to. But he had a feeling that none of the others who had been present for it were going to speak up. As he expected, she just nodded. Yes, please. He then watched her leave the table and head over to a corner. He had noticed that some tears were starting to go down her face. No doubt that mental link that formed between them when Richard took on her powers allowed her to feel his rage at that key moment. He also saw Jubilation get up and head over to Yvette's side. He had to say this for Jubilee. The girl really had compassion for anyone on the team, with the possible exception of Monet. Of course, he realized that part of this was because of the girl's past with the X-Men. After the other event, though, Jubilee had been hanging with Yvette almost every day. He returned his attention to the table when he heard Jean ask, So, what happened after that, Angelo? I take it whatever it was very traumatic for everyone. Angelo had to mentally agree with what Jean had said. He nodded and closed his eyes for a moment, keeping his concentration as he let a grim look cross his face. Well, you could say that. You could also say that you don't have to worry about Black Tom anymore. He saw a look of shock cross the faces of both Jean and Scott. He could also see that Scott was trying to find words for the obvious question to come. So he cut it off and continued the tale.